Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto was born before the Nine Tails attacked. Really, how much can small things affect the world? Little things like the color of someone's hair? Their mentor? Maybe, their date of birth? Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 37, Familiar Talks. Naruto couldn't help the smile that grew on his face when he appeared in his living room, only to spot Anko curled up on the couch. He hadn't expected her to stay up for him, and usually when he found her like this there were a lot more empty bottles of sake strewn around. He tested his side again and only felt a minor twinge, so he felt safe enough to gently pick her up and started carrying her upstairs. She hated it when he flashed around the house with her, said it made her nauseous. It seemed his efforts were for naught though, as she gently stirred while he was climbing the stairs. "Hey you," she mumbled, shifting to get more comfortable. "You were gone for a while." "I came back though." Anko just smiled sleepily, lifting her head as best she could for a kiss. Naruto met her halfway. "You always do." "There was just something I needed to do." He almost laughed at her sleepy attempt to look quizzical. "You get it done." "I hope so." "Good." She nodded like a child who had been told the monsters had been cleared from the closet. "Done like it when you're gone." Naruto could only sigh at that, still smiling. "Me neither. Can you believe we're going to be parents?" she suddenly said as he moved into their room. "Me and you. Believe it?" he asked with a chuckle. "No way." He quickly leaned down before she could reply. "Ecstatic about it." He stole a quick kiss, leaving Anko pouting when he pulled away. "Absolutely." She smiled at that, mewling adorably when he set her down on the bed. She immediately grabbed his arm and dragged him down with her before he could move away. "I love you." It was Naruto's turn to smile as she kissed him, still looking barely awake. He realized something, lying there with Anko at his side, her purple hair messily falling over her face and just the faintest hints of drool at the corner of her lip. It's something he'd thought 100,000 times before, and every time he'd meant it, honestly. But just then, in the weak moonlight streaking through the blinds, with him covered in bruises, and her in overly large t-shirt, that he'd never thought it quite like this. "Marry me." Anko just chuckled in that sleepy way. "Sure." Naruto's smile grew, she wasn't taking him seriously. "No really, marry me." She languidly shifted her neck, bringing her face level with his, but something about the way he was looking at her must have alerted her as she was suddenly very much awake. "You're serious?" "Never more so in my life." And even he was surprised by just how much he meant that. "I did a lot today, but all of it just reminded me that life is short, for shinobi, shorter. I love you. I could never imagine myself not loving you." He smiled, wrapping an arm around her and pulling her until they were flush, this close he could only see her eyes, the eyes that always reminded him of chocolate from the first day he met her. "So, marry me?" "This isn't because." He saw her eyes glance down to her stomach. "No, this." He lightly tickled her belly, making her squirm in his grip, "was because I love you." "And this?" He lifted her chin until they were eye to eye again, capturing her lips and prolonging the kiss until they were forced to come up for air, "is because I love you." This time he just wrapped his arms around her, letting her nestle her head into the crook of his arm. "I'm asking you to marry me, because I want to marry you. I don't need another reason." He heard a faint sniff, and when he looked down, Anko was doing an admirable job of not letting herself cry, smirking playfully up at him. "Yeah, then where's my ring?" The redhead looked up thoughtfully for a moment before grinning, reaching down and gripping her hand lightly, thumb and index finger over her ring finger. Anko felt a tingle and watched as a small, thin Hiraishin shiki wrapped around the base of her finger. "I'm sure I can come up with something better, but until then how's Dash?" He never got the chance to finish as Anko stopped admiring her new accessory and quickly turned to capture his lips. When she finally released him, he noticed an all too familiar gleam enter her eye. "You woke me up." "Well, I'm sure there's something I can do to make it up to you." "Oh, I have some ideas. However, when she suddenly reversed their positions, straddling him with the hungry glint only growing stronger, Naruto winced. The pain in his side suddenly flared up. Sakura was good, but she wasn't a miracle worker. Anko immediately noticed his discomfort, and its source. A frown swiftly replaced her smirk. But first, maybe you want to tell me what exactly you've been doing. The redhead could only grin sheepishly. Funny story that. So, let me get this straight, Kakashi drawled, spread out over one of the couches to the side of the Hokage's office. You managed to fight a Kage, winning mind you, and a potential war before it really picks up, got engaged to your longtime girlfriend, after finding out she's pregnant, and you get thrown in the doghouse, all in the same day. Naruto wasn't sure why he was allowing Kakashi to mock him like this, aside for some residual respect for him as an Umbu captain, that particular well was very quickly drying up. Same evening actually, he replied, as thought they were talking about an old mission instead of the day before. Kakashi whistled a long note. Damn, you really do work fast, don't you? Naruto gave the man a level stare. Don't you have, I don't know, missions, or training, or something? Kakashi put his hands up in mock surrender, the eye smile giving away his insincerity. Well, I mean, if you really insist, Hokage-sama. Naruto bit back a groan. People had been jibing him like that all day. Don't call me that, it's not official yet. As good as I'm afraid, my boy, Hiruzen said as he walked into the room. Word of your actions yesterday have spread remarkably fast. His eyes crinkled with mirth. I believe the Hyuga are actually rather upset with you for ending the war before too much Kumo blood could be spilt. He glanced around the room quickly, noting the singular Naruto behind what was increasingly the Namikaze's desk, instead of his own. No shadow clones today. What's the point? The redhead lamented. It's not like I have anywhere to be in a hurry. Anko will hold this grudge for a few days yet, so I might as well give all of this. He motioned somewhat morosely to the stacks of documents lining every inch of the desk, my full attention. Hiruzen merely smiled as he sank into a particularly plush chair to the other side of the office from Kakashi. Spoken like a true Kage. At that point, Naruto had simply had enough and allowed his head to fall forward, smacking into the desk with a rather satisfying thump. Not you two, he mumbled from somewhere between a C-rank mission report and a stack of requisition forms. Comes with the territory, my boy. The elder Hokage jibed without a hint of remorse, nursing his pipe with a malicious grin. Naruto sighed as he sat back up, pulling a sheet of paper from where it had stuck to his forehead. He gave it a quick glance and frowned. It would likely belong in a pile that was beginning to grow worryingly large. Many reports from the grass region that spoke of unusual movements from the Iwa side of things. As they trickled in from border scouts in the area, they were painting an increasingly depressing picture. Iwa was mobilizing. What do you make of these? Naruto asked, passing one of the more worrying reports, of an incursion by Iwa scouts into Hinokuni itself, over to the older man. Hiruzen barely had to give it a cursory glance before exhaling a large cloud of smoke, his features quickly losing their amused edge. I suspected something like this, although I maintained hope that Unaki would live up to his title and be a bit more cautious. He stood up and placed the report back in its appropriate pile, choosing instead to stand by the window, one of his preferred vantage points to look out over what, for the longest time, he had considered his village. I think that as my old rival grows older, younger, more energetic voices begin to hold sway in Iwa. He took another puff of his pipe, the brief pause allowing him to collect his thoughts. The grudges from the old wars run deep, many having lost fathers, mothers, husbands, and wives. They've smelt the blood in the water and, while I hoped Kumogaku's withdrawal back to their borders would stem any rash actions from our northern cousins, it seems opportunism has won out. Another pause. I'm afraid if Unaki has been swayed to another invasion, it will take a little more than a duel to push back that particular tide. Naruto winced at the subtle jab at his own rash actions before sobering as he examined another report. Iwa weren't even trying to hide their intentions, banking on Konoha's northern border still being stretched thin from the joint assault from their smaller neighbors. With grass locked in skirmishing actions in the northern towns, it would be all too easy for Iwa to sweep in, en masse, and bypass the old killing grounds of the Ame region. To redraw their forces against such an assault would leave them open to a counter-attack from Orochimaru, and even though Taki had essentially backed off since the capture of their Jinchuriki, they couldn't exactly trust their disloyal former allies to play nice in the meantime. Konoha was running short on men, and even shorter on a far more precious resource, friends. After the invasion, trust with Suna was thin at best. The smaller villages had made their opinions of Konoha all too clear. Kumo was now in a tentative position Naruto wouldn't dare begin to rock, and Kiri, well, despite their re-emergence into the world since their bloody civil war, nobody really knew what Kiri's intentions were. For all Naruto knew, they would be the next to try and take a bite out of Fire Country. You have some time yet to think on this, Naruto, Hiruzen reminded him. Unagi is slow to make decisions, and if he has decided on invading, it will take him time to organize. He knows he only has one avenue to invade through since Ame closed its borders, and there's little love lost between Iwa and Grass. That's if Grass doesn't turn around and reinforce Iwa's invasion. Naruto argued. He was surprised at the ferocity in Hiruzen's eyes when the older man turned. Then we make them pay for it tenfold. He walked over to the map table Naruto had meticulously restored. With a few improvements of his own, it was now a great deal easier to quickly update as information changed. Iwa is not the most fertile country, relying a great deal on food imports from the land of stone, fangs, birds, and valleys to the south. He ran a ringer along the line of smaller countries that formed a wedge between Kaze no Kuni and Chuchi no Kuni. In any prolonged war, Iwa knows we'll cut that supply off by any means necessary. The village itself can survive, but only by taxing food from surrounding towns. Eventually the daimyo of Earth will intervene and veto their war the moment it becomes too costly for the country. He shook his head. No, Unagi knows a protracted war with Konoha, when we are more than capable of feeding ourselves as long as necessary, would be ill-advised. Another puff from the pipe. He will put everything into his initial offensive and try to cut as large a section of our land out as he can, likely hoping to use that to grow food for any further actions he takes in the war. He outlined the rough area that was currently a hotbed of guerrilla warfare with Grass shinobi. We rebuff that first offensive and Unagi will be forced to back off. Naruto frowned. Konoha was already weakened and Iwa would have the advantage of first move. That will be costly. Hiruzen nodded sadly. As all wars ultimately are. Naruto walked around and scrutinized the map. There must be another way, maybe a counter-offensive that relies on some advantage we have in the territory, or a preemptive strike. I wouldn't worry yourself over it too much today, my boy. I'm still around to pick up the slack, for now, Hiruzen consoled, scrutinizing the map himself, mind going through similar loops as his young successor. As I understand it, we may be very busy in the coming months. I would take the opportunity to enjoy the relative peace while we still can. Naruto nodded idly, not sure how he could possibly slack off now of all times. I'll try. He didn't sound all that committed to it. Hiruzen sighed, knowing what the younger man was thinking. He had been in the same position many times before. He glanced up, noting that Kakashi had left early into the conversation. Talk about war with Iwa must have been uncomfortable considering what he lost in their last conflict. He patted the redhead on the shoulder before moving over to a stack of reports. There was a time to allow Naruto to learn the ins and outs of the position, and there was a time to provide everything he could to help, as was a Konoha shinobi's duty. We'll think of something, go Daimedano. He was glad to see the small, bemused smile that briefly lifted the redhead's lips. He wasn't sure why his feet pulled him in the direction of the Uchiha compound that night as he made his way home. A part of him knew it was probably just procrastination, to put off dealing with a grouchy, vindictive Anko, although coming back late probably wouldn't help the situation. A different part of him supposed it was habit. He often used to come here, in better days, before Shisui died, before Itachi. Back then it was a comforting place, where he could work off frustration with a good spar, where he could talk through his problems, where he knew a receptive ear was waiting. He didn't share everything with Anko back then, some things just had to stay between guys. Nowadays, well, he couldn't quite recall the last time he had been here. The old sturdy gate was just how he remembered it, although the fact that he could just push it open was different. It used to take knocking very loud just to get a passing Uchiha on the other side to come open it up. Inside the compound was disconcerting, so empty compared to his memories of a bustling little community with kids, and shops, and packs of mothers gossiping about their children's stories from the academy. Despite how long it had been, his feet knew the way easily, and he was outside of the Uchiha clan head's house before he really knew what he was doing, giving the door a soft rap. A small, rebellious part of his mind hoped nobody answered, but eventually the door slid open. He hadn't even heard footsteps on the other side. Even decades of retirement couldn't take away such ingrained skills. Hey. He cursed himself internally at the rather lame greeting, but rewarded all the same by a soft, if slightly surprised smile from Mikoto. Oh, Naruto-kun, what an unexpected pleasure. The redhead nearly winced. He knew the woman was only being sincere. He had known her long enough to know she barely had an unkind bone in her body, and it was no wonder she hadn't found the shinobi lifestyle to her liking, but it still felt like a stab to the chest to be reminded how much he had been avoiding this exact meeting. Yeah, I'm sorry for not coming around before. Or anywhere nearly as much as he owed her, the rebellious voice piped in. I suppose. He paused right there before he could make a mistake. No, I really don't have an excuse. I guess I've kind of been avoiding this. Mikoto just smiled sadly, glancing back into the house. We all deal with tragedies in our own ways. She brightened up slightly as she stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. What's important is you're here. I assume you came for Sasuke. He's in his room. She bit her lip as they walked further into the house. It was furnished differently than Naruto remembered. He supposed neither of them wanted too many reminders of what happened. Sasuke has been rather upset since coming back from his last mission. I get the feeling he's beating himself up over what happened. Naruto had read the report and was more inclined to blame the Hyuga heir if he was honest with himself, although he knew that was just protectiveness over his students. Nobody was really to blame over what happened, and he knew Sasuke had done the best he could, given the situation. I'll talk to him. Mikoto smiled fondly. I remember you saying the same thing when Itachi. She trailed off, glancing at a nearby photo of the four of them, Sasuke, Itachi, Mikoto and Fugaku. She bit her lip again and took a deep breath. You were always such a good friend to him, and I wanted to thank you. You don't have to thank me for that. Itachi was just as much a friend to me as I was to him, for as long as it lasted. He was beginning to grow uncomfortable with the old emotions being dredged up here. No, not for that. I could see how happy the three of you and that girl, Anko, were together. She smiled fondly. I heard you two are engaged now. Congratulations. Naruto returned the smile. News really does travel fast in this village. Yes, well, shinobi go on missions and wives gossip. It's the way of things. There was some humor in her voice as she said it. He was glad for that at least. But no, I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for Sasuke. Naruto grew a little confused at that. He really didn't think he'd done anything more than any sensei would for their student, but Mikoto quickly explained. We were both in a very dark place after the incident. I tried my best to be there for him, but I was grieving myself for the longest time. When I finally felt ready to be a mother again, to be the support he needed, in a way it was too late. He had already started walking a dark road. She ripped her gaze away from the picture, but her eyes were no less sad. I thought I might have lost both my sons that night, and no matter how hard I tried to be there for him, maybe I let him get away with too much, maybe I wasn't strict enough with him, I don't know, he just kept pushing me further away. She managed a small smile as she looked up at the redhead. Until you. I don't dash. Mikoto held up a hand to cut him off. It must have been, a month or so after he joined your team, after that mission to Nami. He came back in, sat down at the table, and for the first time in so long he began to talk to me about his day. She smiled fondly. He couldn't stop talking about how exciting the mission had been, at how surprised with his teammates he was, and how far he had to go to catch up with his sensei, not because he wanted to kill his brother, but because he'd found someone genuinely strong to look up to. She looked around and Naruto was surprised to find tears percolating at the edge of her eyes. In some ways I got my son back that day, and I don't know if it was you, or his teammates, or maybe he just needed time, but I wanted to thank you all the same. She continued to surprise him by moving forward and briefly wrapping her arms around the stunned teen, and, just for a moment, Naruto nearly felt tears of his own gather as, despite how much time passed, despite the difference in height between them, he couldn't help but be reminded of how his mother used to hold him. He was almost a little sorry when she finally stepped back, although he'd managed to get his expression back under control before she could see, wearing a wide but genuine smile. Always happy to help. Mikoto nodded, patting him gently on the cheek. You haven't changed at all, have you? Well, I like to think I've gotten more handsome, he shot back cheekily, happy to elicit a small laugh from the older woman. Well, I can't deny you inherited your father's looks. Mikoto admitted with a roll of her eyes. The moment was interrupted though by a soft padding of feet down the stairs. Sensei? What are you doing here? Sasuke asked, understandably confused considering Naruto hadn't so much as stepped foot within the Uchiha compound since their team had formed. I'll just leave you to it then, Mikoto said. I'll make some tea, if you're staying. She looked to Naruto, only for the redhead to shake his head. Not for long most likely. This was sort of spur of the moment and I still need to get back to Anko. Mikoto nodded understandingly and shut the door behind her, leaving Sasuke standing there uncertainly on the stairs. Sensei, if this is about Ami. Naruto quickly put a hand up, cutting him off. Actually, no. He closed his eyes for a moment. I understand you did everything you could, those Kumonin were more experienced, you were outclassed and outnumbered and dash. But I shouldn't have been. Sasuke cut in heatedly, shaking his head a moment later. We shouldn't have been. I should never have let Hinata run off like that, I should have retreated the moment we knew something was off, I should never have let Ami. He trailed off, fist clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He nearly jumped when Naruto put a hand on his shoulder. Sasuke, you can't beat yourself up over this. Being in a position of command, things can't always go the way you plan and sometimes, no matter how much we might hate it, or wish that it went differently, things go wrong. They wouldn't have, if it was you there instead of me. Sasuke muttered darkly. Naruto had to bite back a wince. Sasuke didn't know quite how deeply that stung, even if it was supposed to be praise. I'm still not strong enough, not for Itachi, and not for Ami. Naruto just squeezed his shoulder. Like I said, you can't think like that. He smiled, although it was a little forced. Besides, it's not like we've given up on Ami, she's strong, you and I know that best. He was surprised to see Sasuke smile slightly. She really surprised me, you know. All through the academy she was always dead last in everything, just another one of those useless, funning girls I didn't expect to make it past the first year. But she clung on, even making it to my team. I thought she'd be a dead weight there too, and it irritated me when you said you would treat us all equally. The idea that you could bring her up to my level, to any kind of level. But then she grew so quickly, catching up to me so fast that I actually felt threatened by the dead last. The dark-haired teen sighed, looking up at his old teacher with searching eyes. How did you do that? How did you see that potential? Naruto chuckled slightly, motioning for the Uchiha to follow him as they made their way outside. You say that as if I have some special gift or something. There's potential in everyone, Sasuke, things that some people are better at than others. Can you honestly say you could ever be as good a medic as Sakura? Sasuke shrugged. There was a lot of memorization involved with medical jutsu, but at the same time a situational creativity that was so uniquely Sakura. So, what? It's just about seeing the best in everyone. This time it was Naruto's turn to shrug. Sasuke's gaze quickly turned dark. What if it isn't there? His expression lost his intensity when Naruto tripped him slightly, sighing tiredly. I didn't come here to discuss your brother, Sasuke, you know that line of thought leads nowhere. That seemed to remind Sasuke of what he'd said before. What did you come here for? I thought this place had bad memories for you too. Naruto looked around, spotting a vacant shop that he remembered as one of Shisui's favorites because the owner would sometimes sell him fireworks on the sly. There's a lot of good memories here too, but I'm not here to talk about the past, or even dwell on it. He chuckled, still uncertain of what he was about to ask. Quite the opposite actually. They had reached the gates of the compound, so Naruto turned, biting his lip slightly. I don't have a lot of guy friends. I mean, Kakashi was my captain and Tenzo's my subordinate, and I don't really know Azuma or Genma and them, kinda missed that chance in Umbu. Sensei, you're rambling, Sasuke deadpanned. Right. He chuckled sheepishly. Well, I don't know if you heard, but I asked Anko to marry me and, well, it's funny. He rubbed the back of his head sheepishly as Sasuke nodded. I always kind of imagined Shisui and Itachi would be there for me when the day finally came and, well, obviously. He slumped over, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Kami, I'm bad at this. Are you asking me to be your best man? Sasuke asked, eyes wide in genuine astonishment. Well, yeah. I mean, not that you're some replacement for your brother or anything, I don't mean that at all and. I'll just shut up now, he finished as he saw Sasuke's eyes narrow slightly. Why me? At that Naruto found he could finally smile genuinely. Because you're my precious student, and I want you to be there for me. He could see Sasuke was confused by the offer and waved a hand absently. Just think on it maybe. He was about to turn and leave when an Umbu dropped into the compound, usually frowned upon by clans unless the news was urgent. Taijo, news from the hospital. The redhead just glanced at the operative, finding him vaguely familiar, one of the newer recruits towards the end of his tenure. Go on. It's your student, sir, she's back. At that all thoughts of weddings and questions fled from both Naruto and Sasuke's minds as the redhead gave a quick glance at the Uchiha, nodded, placed his hand on the younger teen's shoulder and teleported them both in a flash. It was a few hours before Sakura cleared Ami as well enough to be debriefed in the presence of her team, her sister, and the Sandaime. The girl had been confused when she came through the gates, sprinting back to Konoha from wherever she had been, like a woman on a mission. She couldn't even tell anyone why, just that she'd had an overwhelming urge to get back to Konoha as fast as possible, to Sakura's chagrin. The girl had managed to loosen her carefully wrapped bandages in her haste and Sakura was keeping her in the hospital until she was sure she hadn't worsened any internal injuries. She was equally vague about just how she'd gotten away from the Kumo shinobi. She recounted everything right up to the moment she jumped from the cliff, a moment that had everyone from her team wanting to simultaneously throttle and comfort her. But details from after that to the moment she stopped outside the massive reinforced gates of the village were vague and disjointed at best. Even when Sakura pointed out that the bandages she was wrapped in weren't the standard issue given out to Chunin teams, meaning somebody must have cared for her, she had no good answers. She looked visibly pained when she tried to think about what happened, nearly causing Sakura to ask everyone to leave. Naruto and Hiruzen were the most disturbed as the signs pointed to a powerful genjutsu and external influence. But if this was another village, Kumo being the most likely, why would they simply return Ami to Konoha? Was it the deal with the Raikage? But then why the genjutsu? Hiruzen thanked the girl for the report and left with a troubled look, and after it became clear Ami wasn't in much condition to hold a conversation Sasuke followed him. However, he surprised everyone when he paused in front of Ami's bed, reaching down awkwardly for a stiff, stilted hug before hurrying from the room. Sakura followed him out with a bemused expression, have already made her feelings on Ami's return clear during the time she was treating the girl. Naruto was about to leave too, to let Ami and Yojao talk, when she croaked from the bed. I did as you trained me, sensei, didn't I? He paused, coming back to side on the side of the bed and rest his hand in her hair, ruffling it gently in the way she hated so much. Yeah, you did, and you did amazingly, more than I could ever have asked. The girl gave a tired smile, already feeling the effect of the anesthetic Sakura gave her. There was a commotion from the hallway before Anko, with Haya peeking over her shoulder, came bursting into the room, clearly about to announce herself exuberantly. With both Naruto's and Yojao's hands over her mouth it came out more as a muffled jumble. The spectacle still managed to draw a chuckle from the girl though, especially when Haya jumped from Anko's back to land on the side of her bed, looking down at her with big watery eyes. Is Ami Neshin okay? Ami was clearly struggling to stay awake at this point, but managed to smile brilliantly for the younger girl. Nothing some rest can't fix. She motioned with her arms and Haya took the cue, crawling up next to the violet as Ami drifted off to sleep, huddled in tight. Strong kid, Anko remarked, unable to do anything but smile at the adorable scene. That she is, Naruto agreed, hiding his concerns for now. She'll be just fine, Yojeo finished as all three adults shared a look, before settling down in a comfy spot to watch over the two young girls. It would be a long night. Chapter 38, Familiar Strategies. Naruto scrutinized the report for what felt like the fifth time, tossing it back on the pile with an undignified huff. Being in this office for so long must have been doing strange things to his head. It doesn't matter how many times I look through these, they just don't make sense. Hiruzen nodded absently, similarly entrenched in field reports. He was lending whatever aid he could while the potential war with Iwa loomed on the horizon. Already countless plans had been discussed as countermeasures for actions Iwa might take, including a few that took advantage of Suna's lacking border patrols to the north of their desert. However, the picture these reports were painting. I admit this is rather unusual, certainly not Unaki's usual way of handling things, he agreed, aged brow furrowing lightly as his eyes scanned another document. Different writing, same message. You think there's been a shift in leadership, maybe in response to me? Naruto asked, pushing back from the desk to wander over to the map table. There were now a few icons littering its surface showing some of the larger forward outposts, updated in real time by sealing scrolls his gave to certain members of various teams. Rather ingenious if he was honest with himself, they would flash red if the shinobi pushed chakra through them in a certain way, alerting the need for reinforcements. He was hoping to work on them so that the seals could relay different kinds of messages for more specific scenarios. Unaki is too stubborn for that, and our spies in the village haven't alerted us of anything as important as that, Hiruzen mused. No, I think the Chuchikage will do his best to take that hat to his grave. Naruto grunted, throwing a folder back onto its pile. Then I can't make sense of it. What had them so befuddled were odd reports of certain squads of Iwa shinobi pulling back to their village. This alone wouldn't have been so unusual, just a sign that the Chuchikage had decided against aggressive action. The problem was there had already been a few skirmishes, and normally when Unaki committed to an action he never second-guessed himself, at least in Hiruzen's extensive history with the man. Then there was the manner of the withdrawal. Usually such an order would be a unified action across all engaged squads, pulling back roughly at the same time. What they were seeing instead was individual squads pulling back in turn, as though one messenger was being sent on a round trip, a ludicrously inefficient system when some teams were actively engaged while others were retreating. It was almost as if the leaders of each squad had just decided to up and abandon their duty. However, this was no disorganized rout. There was a pattern in the order the squads pulled out. Neither Naruto or Hiruzen could make sense of it though. I fear we may not be able to understand our turn in luck, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't take advantage of it, my boy. On that the two of them were most definitely agreed. The moment they had reports of Iwa shinobi returning to their borders, Naruto already had orders on the go to redistribute their own squads. It was time for the decisive action he and the older Hokage had been planning for weeks. It would take some time to get everything in position, but when they were, Konoha would finally be in a position to end this war. Taki was already crippled by the loss of their Jinchuriki, and as long as Konoha kept up a strong border between the two countries, they would retreat to their isolationist tendencies, easily brought to the negotiating table. Kusa on the other hand posed slightly more of a problem given the still tenuous situation with Iwa. They couldn't launch a devastating offensive on the minor village. That would be like putting down a welcome mat for Iwa to take the initiative again. Instead they planned to destroy all but one of the major transport routes between the two countries. The small nation was filled with valleys and dense jungle, so were rather reliant on the bridges and roads already cleared. Most of them would be destroyed within the next few hours, leaving them with only one, tightly controlled route in and out of the country. This would also serve to bottle up Iwa if this turned out to be some elaborate ploy. The idea was for their opponents to be distracted with reconstructing the routes long enough for Konoha to launch a crushing attack against Otogakure. There was little mercy in that offensive, orders to capture if possible, but no addendums to go out of their way if it was too risky. Orochimaru would be made to regret fanning the flames of this uprising. Even Hiruzen looked decidedly unsympathetic as he recommended certain squad positions that would ensure a full cordon of the village. The two men couldn't take all of the credit though. The operation was only possible thanks to the information Tairyu had volunteered. That wasn't the facetious volunteer that Ibiki might have used either. The red-headed Spitfire had surprised the TNI department a few days after Naruto's visit by, quietly and without struggle, offering up everything she knew about Orochimaru and the shinobi under his command in exchange for swapping sides and protection from potential retaliation. Naruto wasn't sure whether this was because of what he'd said, or if she simply didn't believe in Orochimaru like many of his brainwashed underlings seemed to. For all he knew, she had some vendetta against the man, and this was some final form of revenge. She wasn't exactly the type to wax poetic about her many woes, or even really talk about herself. There had been some concerns with the validity of the information, but a few Umbu scouting parties had confirmed the locations of various bases and outposts without alerting the Oto shinobi. Likewise, the problem of the girl's curse mark, and the fact that she seemed rather attached to its power, unsurprising considering its addictive nature and the amount of time she had been using it, had been brought up. Luckily Naruto hadn't been idle since he had removed Anko's. That procedure 4 years ago had been enlightening as to the inner workings of the ugly seal, and when it came time to removing Tayuya's, he didn't even need Hana on hand. It wasn't entirely the same, granted. He finally learned what the medical aspect of the seal was for, a kind of enzyme that altered the body's physiology and allowed the passive, if not slightly corrupted, absorption of natural chakra from the environment. There was unfortunately little he could do about that, and Tayuya was currently in the hospital being treated for the effects of the enzyme on her system. It would be a while before she was in fighting condition again. It was rather like being treated for severe drug withdrawal. He paced back and forth along the edge of the map table, scrutinizing the positions of his forces, anxious that he couldn't be out there with them. Hiruzen seemed to anticipate his thoughts, taking a long drag from his pipe while giving the younger Kage, it was all but made official at this point, a knowing look. You should become used to that feeling. As a leader, you will have to learn the stark lesson that you cannot always be leading every charge. He glanced down at the landscape, the elemental nations, poised for war, with a sigh. Although I had hoped under more forgiving circumstances. No, I understand that just fine, but... The redhead struggled with his words for a moment. You don't trust your shinobi to do the job well. Hiruzen offered with a hint of amusement, purposefully baiting the comment. Naruto shot him a quick glare. You know that's not it. He returned to his pacing. It was a bad habit to get into, he knew, but moving helped him focus his thoughts. It's just, if things go wrong I have to wonder if it wasn't because I could have done better. Trust Naruto. You must trust that you have chosen your people well. Trust that everybody will do their job when the time comes. Trust in the will of fire. You really mean that, don't you? Naruto asked, half bemused at the thought. He believed flowery words were all well and good in the academy, to get the students inspired, moral boosting really. But in a theater of war like this? He had to trust in individual abilities, careful strategies, and proven capabilities, not nebulous concepts like the will of fire. Every word, since the first day Tobirama-sensei shared it with me. He gave a long puff of his pipe and looked thoughtfully out the window. What is the will of fire to you, Naruto? The redhead was a little caught off guard by the question, taking a moment to wave his hand lamely. You know, the unity of the village, the whole brotherhood of shinobi that unite under a common cause. Hiruzen smiled softly. A nice thought, and admittedly, a part of it. He raised himself up to walk over to the window. I see the will of fire in every merchant peddling their wares, in every child playing at being ninja, in every shinobi talking with the regular citizens. It's an understanding, one of responsibility and gratitude. When a merchant sells his goods, the tax he generates goes towards arming and training the ninja that ultimately allows him to sell for another day. The shinobi protect the civilians, and the civilians give the shinobi purpose. So, it's reciprocity. Naruto had never heard the Hokage speak so bluntly about something like this before. He enjoyed hiding behind his half-truths and riddled words. At its most fundamental, it's human nature. The older Hokage explained. The will of fire isn't some special concept exclusive to Konoha, but here, it is our foundation. The other shinobi villages, they prize their military above all else, the citizenry are simply ways to feed and arm their ninja. Here though, the implicit understanding is that the shinobi serve the client, never the other way around. He smiled lightly as he turned, partially framed by the light coming in through the window. There is a reason Konoha is the most popular village, why we receive the most foreign clients. Naruto actually had to process that for a minute. He supposed he implicitly knew all of this before, vaguely in the back of his mind. But to hear it said aloud. You've weaponized human decency. Konoha's most dangerous weapon wasn't its military strength, it was the civilians, the hard blood of the village that allowed it to thrive. Other villages bled the surrounding area dry to sustain themselves, subsidized by their daimyo. In Konoha, though, it was a community, damn near independent from the capital itself. In fact, if it wouldn't have launched the country into a horrendous civil war, Konoha could have cut ties with the daimyo a long time ago. He would have thought this was transcendent strategic planning on the part of the Shodaime if he also didn't know a bit about the man from Hiruzen's stories. As it was, this was all likely a happy accident resulting from an idealistic man with the monstrous power required to put those ideals in place. His brother, on the other hand, if anybody could have honed such a concept into such a sleek and weaponized form, it was Tobirama Senju. We Hokage are not exempt from that will either. The bond of trust has to run both ways. They trust us to lead them to prosperity and victory, and we in turn trust in them to deliver it. So basically, you're telling me to stop worrying so much, Naruto summed up with a weak smile. He felt like a house had been dropped on him. Oh no, by all means worry away. Hashirama-sama was a wonderful worrier. He nearly paced a groove into the floor of this very office every time he sent people on tough missions. I'm asking you to simply trust in yourself. That you have made the right decisions. Hard to do when you don't know the result. Hiruzen just gave that knowing smile again. Quite. He glanced down at the map. Although in this case I understand if the sensation is a tad more personal. Naruto tried to hide it, but Hiruzen easily caught the flicker of his eyes moving down to a small icon on the map, a ways west of Otogakure itself. It was the site of one of Orochimaru's more valuable research facilities, apparently housing many of his captive bloodline prisoners he used in his experimentation. When Tayuya was asked which base Orochimaru was most likely to reinforce personally if threatened, she had pointed to this facility without even thinking about it. There were some irreplaceable subjects housed there that the man would be genuinely pained to lose. Which made it the ideal target of a feint, designed to draw Orochimaru out of Otogakure for the duration of the operation. Kami knew that if the man was allowed to meet the attack himself, it had a much high probability of failing. Konoha just didn't have many shinobi of his caliber. Kakashi came close, but the older Sannin would still get the better of him. Guy might stand a chance for a while, but there was a great deal more to Orochimaru than his taijutsu prowess. There were maybe 4 ninja who could put the man down. Jiraiya was off, somewhere, unreliable as ever. Tsunade was a non-factor as far as Hiruzen was concerned, although Naruto personally described it as acting like a petulant child. Hiruzen was already in the mindset that he was no longer able to keep up with his wayward student. And Naruto was stuck here, coordinating. He was currently the only person able to operate the various sealing mechanisms that signaled when Orochimaru had left the village. That's what had Naruto so anxious. He felt like he should be there to deal with his fiancée's old teacher. The more logical side of his mind assured him that if it was just leading Orochimaru on a merry chase for an hour or two, Kakashi was more than capable. That's what he was forced to do, remind himself over and over that everyone was where they were because they had to be. There were roles necessary to end this war right here, and his was in this room, where he had the most expansive view of the situation. It's painful, I know, Hiruzen consoled softly, but there will be opportunities to flex your legs in the future, you can be sure of that. The fact that Orochimaru would definitely survive all of this went unsaid. There were still monsters in the world that needed put down, whether it was him, the Akatsuki, or something else. He now had to be a scalpel, a precision instrument, a trump card. He couldn't just be thrown into every situation. That would set a bad precedent. There was a reason Kage only showed up to fight when things got bad. A knock came from the door and Ami walked in without waiting for a response. Naruto bit back a smile at the sight. He had almost forgotten he had given his genin an open door policy when they had shared a team. He supposed technically he had never revoked it, although he could tell Ami was being cheeky by abusing it. Sensei, you said you would be training us today. She knew that, again technically, Naruto wasn't her sensei anymore. However, there was something of a precedent for Hokage keeping on their old teams together for a while longer than normal. Tobirama kept his through a war, right up to his final sacrifice. The Sunin had never really stopped being Hiruzen's students, despite their scattering, and Kakashi still only thought of one man as his teacher. I don't remember saying anything of the sort, and you're supposed to be on leave. Naruto shot back, somewhat glad for the interruption. His thoughts had been going in a bleak direction. Ami always managed to lighten his mood. Yeah, you did. She replied without hesitation, ignoring the accusation. I asked if you would train us yesterday and you said. She held a hand to her throat for a moment, a trick he knew came from Anko when the woman wanted to do a particularly eerie impersonation. The redhead blinked. That was a pretty spot-on impression of the non-committal answer he'd give when distracted. Well, I'm a little busy at the moment. Oh, please. By all means, Hiruzen said with a treacherous smile. Nothing should be happening here for a few more hours yet. Enjoy some time with your students. Naruto turned but found himself cornered on both sides, especially now that Ami was beaming at him. He couldn't fight that smile. His shoulders slumped theatrically, but he was still wearing a small smile. Well, how am I supposed to argue with that? See you at the training ground, Ami called, secure in her victory. It was an old joke for Team 7, the three students would always say it, knowing Naruto would likely beat them there regardless. The redhead was about to follow when Hiruzen caught him by the shoulder. Naruto, be careful. The teen just stared at him in confusion. I know you went through a scare with young Ami. But don't allow yourself to become overprotective. They are your students, but they are also shinobi of the village. He released Naruto with those cryptic words, returning to the table to tweak a few of the unit positions. Naruto tried to put it out of his mind as he flashed to the training ground, but something about the words stuck. He wasn't coddling his students, was he? He understood there would come a time when they didn't need him anymore, when they were strong enough without him. It's just that time hadn't come yet. Until then he would do everything possible to ensure they survived that long. He nodded to himself as he appeared in the old training ground, distracted just enough that he barely leaned back when a sandaled foot cleaved the air in front of him. Obviously Sasuke was expecting the dodge, as the talented Uchiha was already using the momentum to twist, launching a barrage of kunai. Naruto had no real difficulty dodging them. No ninja worth their salt ever did when fresh and rested. But apparently, a single step back was all Ami needed as the girl suddenly launched herself from the shadow of a nearby tree, turning the step into a stumble with a deft movement from the back of her blade. There was no way she had beaten him to the training ground, so the Ami in the Hokage's office had been a clone. Now when had Anko gone and taught her that? Although that did mean his cute little students had been planning this ambush from the beginning, admirable. That meant at any moment. Yep, he felt the edges of his vision waver slightly, and the next time Sasuke came in for a taijutsu melee he made sure to dodge slightly more than was necessary, unable to trust his depth perception. If the Uchiha was irritated the genjutsu wasn't helping him, he didn't show it, instead flipping back while rushing through a well-worn string of hand seals. The real reason for messing with his vision became obvious when Ami suddenly appeared in his now limited periphery, already brining her blade around in a wind-sheathed slash that would enhance the fireball to actually dangerous levels. Well, dangerous for most opponents. It was an admittedly smoother version of the combo they had used in their Chunin exams, but well coordinated or not, Naruto was the sensei for a reason. With almost languid ease the redhead kicked up one of the discarded kunai Sasuke had thrown earlier. Another kick had it tearing through the air to impact the very edge of Ami's blade. It was barely a tap, but it was enough to throw off the girl's aim just enough that the blade of wind went wide of the fireball. Instead, it sheared right through the base of the tree Naruto assumed Sakura was hiding in as he almost casually sidestepped the roaring ball of flame. In the brief lull as Sakura did indeed jump out of the collapsing tree he broke the genjutsu, pulsing his chakra twice to be sure. Sakura could be a tricky one. Sure enough, Sasuke and Ami suddenly changed positions. That was likely meant to catch him off guard with some sort of planned maneuver later. He was just a little surprised then when a pair of gloved hands suddenly grasped his ankles, attempting to pull him right into the ground. They got him down to his shins before he pulsed his chakra, disrupting the earth technique. But, as with all of their plans so far, they had gone in with the expectation of failure. Ami was suddenly rushing forward, blade poised, but at the last minute he noticed a slight discrepancy with her stance and pulsed his chakra. Instead of a blade aimed at his throat, he found 2 feet wreathed in flames streaking towards him like a javelin. Sasuke was getting creative with his elemental manipulation, and Sakura even more paranoid if she was beginning to triple layer her illusions. Deciding to reverse the situation, Naruto suddenly sank into the ground, hoping to catch the pinkette off guard. Apparently, they'd planned for that too, as he suddenly found himself staring at an already lit explosive tag. Anko was really going to have to stop telling Ami all these insider secrets, it was ruining his teacher mystique. He slipped out of the ground just as it detonated, spreading dust and random clumps of dirt into the air. Nothing too damaging then, which meant Ami from one side, sword already level with his neck, Sasuke from the other, hands wrapped in flames. He turned to face the more pressing threat of a blade only to realize too late that at some point Sakura had swapped all the directions on him. He was about to flash to the kunai he had surreptitious dropped amongst the others at the start of this little ambush only to feel his connection to it severed. Just out the corner of his eye he could spot Sakura grinning as she held up the kunai, ripped clean in half. That girl was getting scary. Not scary enough to have noticed the one he'd left underground though, which had promptly been scattered by their explosion. Ami's blade sliced through nothing but air as Sasuke flicked his hands to remove the flames, a vaguely irritated scowl pulling at his lips. Naruto held up his hands magnanimously as he reappeared a few feet away. Come now, I couldn't let you guys have a win that easily. I'd be a terrible teacher if He took a step forward only for the ground beneath him to explode rather gloriously. From the outside of the near column of flames the 20-something tags hidden just beneath the ground had created, Ami watched with a hint of worry. You don't think it was too much, do you? Sasuke simply grunted as Sakura alighted next to them, the pinkette looking equally worried. It had been her job to place the stacks of tags where she thought it most likely their sensei would appear, so it would be on her head if he got injured. Their worried were replaced by irritation when the dust settled, revealing a slowly dispersing cloud of all too familiar smoke. Just a clone, Sasuke muttered, clicking his tongue as his Sharingan raked the training field for any sign of their teacher. There was no need though, as he appeared a moment later, completely unharmed, sitting up on a sturdy branch of a tree. Well, now I'm starting to think I trained you guys too well. That was mean and sneaky even by Anko standards. Ami had the decency to quash her victory fist pump. Still only managed to get your clone though. Sasuke grouched, his irritation ebbing at the praise. More than most can say, Naruto countered, giving the 3 a good look. They really had come a long way in such a short time, and he had to crush a deep welling of pride before he gathered them all up in a massive group hug that would have been monstrously unprofessional. Maybe worth considering if he ever wanted them properly mortified though, something to think on. Your teamwork is excellent, even after so long apart. He gave a sideways glance at Sakura. Your genjutsu are superb, but you could have left the disorientation a little later if you wanted Sasuke's maneuver to properly catch me off guard. He turned to said Uchiha. The trick with the fire is neat, but when you're trying to be stealthy it gives away your position. I could feel the heat even through the genjutsu. Finally, he turned to Ami. You're too cautious to engage, some of those opening shots designed to trip me up could have been pushed a bit further. A combined assault from you and Sasuke might have seriously harried me. His expression relaxed as a bright grin spread his whiskered cheeks. Now, I believe I was called here for some training. All 3 of his students brightened at the prospect, and the redhead felt something warm spread through his chest. Naruto gently stroked his hair, the 7-year-old long having dozed after almost an hour of Naruto Nishin doing nothing but reading boring old pieces of paper. But Naruto felt he could be given this small indulgence, a boring moment after all this anxiety and chaos was a blessing. The war was over, or as good as. The operation was a success, mostly. Kakashi had given the snake a good run around, but Orochimaru was a clever man and quickly realized he was being played. Luckily Kakashi was good enough at his job that Orochimaru only returned to a sufficiently harried and cowed Otogaku. The attack had been swift and ruthless, with known squads outside the walls, that had been discreetly followed for the past few days, being taken down almost simultaneously, many now finding a home in the cells below the Umbu headquarters. The attack on the village itself was less an invasion, or an outright siege, as it was a surgical strike. As one, multiple key installations in the village had been demolished by carefully written seals designed specifically for each situation, a luxury only a few like Naruto could bring to the table. When the dust settled, a good quarter of the village was in ruin. Konoha's shinobi were already pulling out, and Orochimaru was only given their dust to glare at on their way out. There had been casualties during the retreat, especially when the Sunin arrived on scene, but a few of the braver Jonin held him off long enough to get the majority of the operatives out of there. Apparently there was a new story for Konoha's green beast to boast about in the Dangoya. The important thing, however, was that a message had been sent to the other minor villages. No, not piss off Konoha. As suspected, Takigakuer had retreated in on themselves, cowering under their tree until Konoha inevitably sent out the diplomats. Kusa was trickier, but they understood that any further action would meet with vicious reprisals, and likely see their country turned into a staging ground for an Iwa invasion. Anyone who had read Aim's bloody history clearly didn't want a repeat of their neighbor's murky history. Aside from negotiating the terms of the village's concessions in surrender, which he was leaving to Hiruzen as, for now, the man was just better at all that politicking, Naruto's part in all of this was done. In the war that was, because now came the cleanup. Konoha might have won, but not without casualties. As it was, the hospital was currently overstocked with injured patients, some of whom might never be shinobi again. He knew as much from both the reports he received from Yakushi-sensei, the current head medic, and Sakura's first-hand accounts. Team 7 now regularly met up every other day for a few hours to train, talk and catch up. Ami was officially grounded from missions while she recovered, with the occasional trip to the Yamanaka clan to try and help her confusion over the whole episode. Sasuke was, rather politely, not taking missions until she did, throwing himself into some kind of secret training, likely a new technique if Naruto knew the Uchiha. Sakura was the busy one now, but even the Pinkette made time for her team between shifts. Still, Naruto knew they were all growing agitated. Confined as they were, Ami was one to enjoy activity. Sasuke wasn't the type to restrain himself long, and while Sakura didn't say it out loud, he knew she rather enjoyed the field work of being a mednin as opposed to being stuck in a hospital all day. Luckily, now that this mess was winding down, Naruto was certain he had something for all of them to do. The assault on Otogakuer had outlined a dire weakness when it came to high-level shinobi. Currently Konoha only had a few counters, one an old man and another himself. Jiraiya, while absconding around the nations, was at least doing semi-useful work with his spy network. More than a few Umbu missions had only come out successful thanks to his information. The last of the Sunin, on the other hand, that was a different matter entirely. Naruto looked through the myriad of wounded reports, shinobi who had lost limbs or died because medical attention came too slow, or just wasn't good enough, and decided that Konoha's best medic had been given long enough to mope around, trying to drink and gamble her way into oblivion. He wouldn't be asking. Chapter 39, Official Returns. There was a comforting familiarity to seeing his team waiting for him at the village gates, looking just as expectant as their first C-rank mission. With the distraction of the war and the revelation that he would be a father, he hadn't had time to consider just how much he missed this. It seemed his old Chunin now, the lot of them, felt the same way, although not everything was the same. They were all older for one, with both the girls beginning to grow into their bodies. The red slip of a dress that had looked so ridiculous on Ami when Anko was first trying to boost her confidence, now showed off some developing curves. Sakura looked every bit the medic nin she was trained to be, with a professional ponytail keeping her long hair in order and her old dress swapped out for a shirt, shorts, and a pack strapped to her waist. Sasuke continued to honor the style of the Uchiha, with their high-collared shirts proudly emblazoned with the red and white fan. However, he no longer looked like a kid playing dress-up, trying to emulate the adults around him. Now he looked the part of the hardened Uchiha shinobi, even adopting a long Notaki from his family's armory. He wouldn't be a match for Ami's swordsmanship anytime soon, but with his Sharingan reflexes he was still a menace with the blade. Hiruzen hadn't been too vocal about it, but Naruto knew the old man wasn't too keen on this excursion. Whether it was sentimentality for his wayward student, Tsunade had been allowed to wander around unopposed this long for a reason, or because of how recently Naruto had come into his role as Hokage, the redhead couldn't say. He could understand the last point, the inaugural celebration had been only the other day and already it appeared that Naruto was absconding from his duties. Still, Naruto trusted the village to run under Hiruzen's steady hand for the few weeks he might be gone. Besides, he really didn't trust anybody else would be able to bring the wandering Sannin back, not because he didn't trust his ninja, it was Tsunade he didn't trust. From what her knew of the legendary medic, she didn't take kindly to unwanted news. After a war, he couldn't really afford a couple of umbu limping back to the village with broken bones. "Hey sensei," Ami called as the trio spotted his approach, only to smirk theatrically. "Oh, sorry. Good morning Hokage-sama." Sakura slapped her arm in exasperation at the teasing, but even the pinkette was smiling slightly. "You know, I technically have the power to demote you now." Naruto shot back as he joined the group, nodding a greeting at Sasuke. Ami's eyes widened almost comically as she floundered for a moment. It was nice to see Anko hadn't gotten her hooks in the girl completely. "Ah well, anyway, looking pretty good sensei, very." "Hokage?" Her two teammates just looked at her incredulously. "Very Hokage," Sasuke repeated, his deadpan somehow managing to sound both amused and scathing. Sakura was grinning. "And might I add the sky looks very airy today, wouldn't you say Sasuke?" The Uchiha nodded, a smirk pulling at his lips. "And Konoha seems just a bit city." Briefly ignoring Ami's indignant defense of her rushed choice of wording, Naruto stole a glance down at himself. He still wasn't quite comfortable with his new look, even though Anko had insisted. "What's wrong with the way I look?" Naruto asked, feeling a tad affronted as he glanced down at his clothes. The Jonin jacket, improved to hold a lot more than it used to, was extremely practical, and the lightweight pants and sleeveless vest allowed him full mobility. His knee-high sandaled boots were an affectation of his father's youth, resized, of course, and the simple armguards connected to the back-plated fingerless gloves completed the look. In lieu of anything to sew it onto, he now wore his hitaite on his forehead again. Admittedly he had considered getting something like his father's iconic haori made, but he wasn't just a clone of his father, no matter how awesome the dem coat was. "Nothing, I think it makes you look rugged," Anko consoled lightly, running a finger up his exposed arms that sent a shiver down his spine. "I'm just saying you look too much like, well, a Jonin." Naruto's eyebrow rose. "I am a Jonin." He thumbed the olive jacket to that effect. "No, you're the Hokage," Anko reiterated, poking him in the chest for good measure. "Which is why." She reached under the bed, taking something out of the secret panel Naruto knew about but ignored for her privacy. "I got you this." She handed him a large, flat box with a bright smile. He eyed it warily for a moment. Gifts from Anko could go one of two ways, but after a moment he decided that the slightly anxious smile she wore was too genuine to be a prank and opened it. He was a little surprised at what he first took to be a shirt, but when he opened it up it turned out to be a haori. It wasn't nearly as long as his father's, only going down to the top of his legs, and it was longer in the sleeve, just about covering his elbow. More importantly, it was a vibrant red, not quite the deep bloody color of his hair, but the bright, joyful red of the Hokage hat. He somehow knew they were supposed to be worn in concert. After a moment of just admiring it he realized Anko was still waiting for a response. I know it won't really go with the flak jacket, red and green and all. But it's got more pockets than I think even you could use. I made sure to give the guy the specification for those bigger on the inside seals you like so much, so plenty of room. It's made out of the same material as the umbu uniform so it won't tear easily, although I've got a couple spares for when you inevitably find a way. I mean, I know you didn't want everyone thinking you're copying your dad, but I thought it was different enough, but still enough to honor him, and..." Naruto thought it was the most adorable thing in the world when his fiancée rambled, but he finally put her out of her suffering by silencing her with a kiss. "I love it," he whispered, holding her for a moment before letting her go to try the thing on. After shucking his flak jacket he found it was a great fit. He had to admit it gave him something of a distinguished look. He supposed that was somewhat important for a Hokage. "Well, of course you do," Anko asserted, recovering admirably. "I picked it out after all." Her look immediately took a sultry turn. "Now where's my thanks?" Admittedly, he didn't wear the haori for very long that night, but there was something to be said for waking up the next day and finding it hanging there right next to his father's. The word legacy couldn't help but spring to mind. The Hokage hat did in fact complement the Haori quite nicely, as he had found out when Hiruzen had handed it to him and he had cheerfully slung it on his back. He didn't remember everything he'd said to the awaiting crowds from up on the Hokage tower. He'd had this whole speech planned about successors and the will of fire, but in the end he was too caught up in the excitement and adrenaline of the moment to remember it. They had cheered fairly loudly though, so he couldn't have botched it too badly. Sensei. He started when he realized Ami was tugging on his sleeve. It was still rather novel he had a sleeve to tug. Sorry, zoned out a bit. He glanced up and took note that they had started moving. He recognized the stretch of country road they were on instantly. He had used this route out of the village too many times to count, and estimated they were about 5 minutes out of the gates. That was about enough to reach the threshold where the village stopped frowning on shinobi moving too quickly. Time to pick up the pace. He grinned and took up a light jog, slowly increasing his speed. His students threw glances at one another with thinly veiled irritation. They knew what was coming. He was rather proud with how well they kept up with his punishing pace. Some Green Umbu recruits would have balked an hour ago. He really had trained them well. Even Ami and Sakura, who used to be exhausted by a brief sprint through the village, were only breathing heavily by the time he wound back down to a more manageable pace. They didn't even complain about the slight sheen of sweat. Was that really necessary? Sensei. Ami gasped, already using the techniques he taught them to quickly regulate her breathing and promote recovery. We don't even have a solid location on Lady Tsunade. Maybe, but that means we'll just have to search harder and faster. I want this mission over with as soon as possible. Although he knew that was slightly optimistic. Tsunade was known to wander in what appeared to be a random pattern, but she was far more skilled at avoiding detection than her occasional drunken rampage let on. How else was she able to escape all her various debtors so often? Still, no use wasting the time he had with his students. Last known sighting was Ebizuragai, up in the north. We still have a fair way to go, so I figured I'd teach you each a new technique. He'd been anticipating the sparkle that entered their eyes immediately. Younger shinobi were easy like that. We won't be stopping often, so I expect you guys to learn on the go. He could already see that wouldn't be a problem from the determined look they each adopted. Sakura, I know how much the MedCorp stresses dodging in the field, ironically because of the very woman they were now tracking down, but sometimes that just isn't an option. He ran through hand seals purposefully slowly, both to show them off and because this wasn't a jutsu he used often. When he slammed his foot down, a thick wall of stone rose up in the middle of the road. Doton, Doryu Haki. He checked to make sure the pinkette was paying attention. Useful for blocking routes to your position, and if made strong enough can even stop a few jutsu before breaking. He casually wound up a Rasengan in a hand and shoved it through the wall. It's not indestructible, he warned, pride welling up as Sakura nodded seriously. She'd figure out the strengths and weaknesses of the technique for herself. She was a smart girl. Sasuke. He nearly chuckled at how the Uchiha straightened, Sharingan already spinning in anticipation. I noticed your fondness for the little flame hands trick of yours, so I thought you'd appreciate this. It was one of the few pure fire manipulation techniques I was able to scrounge up. His hands entered the rat seal and after a moment's focus, twin streams of fire erupted from each of his hands. A moment later they intensified and shrank until he was holding 2 white-hot knives of fire in each hand. Draining, but they can cut through damn near anything. He tossed the Uchiha a pair of thick gloves from one of his many new pockets. Thank you, Anko, and gave the younger Chunin a level stare. Be careful learning and using this technique, it's not only dangerous to your enemy. Again, he waited until he was sure the warning had been taken on board. He had such good students. Finally, he turned to last of the trio. The Violet was nearly bouncing with unrestrained excitement. She had been a bit harder to plan for. While the utility of the other two's techniques were apparent, Ami was a bit more straight-laced. She was a skilled Kenjutsu practitioner, that much was obvious, but it wasn't all that defined her. She was creative, often the brains behind some of Team 7's crazier, but no less effective, strategies. Really what she needed was a versatile tool that she could work into her own unique blend of skills. It was a good thing Naruto was so well traveled then. This one might be a bit trickier, Ami, as I can't really profess to know the technique myself. I've only seen it in use and reverse engineered what I could. Fear wouldn't be happy with him, but then, she was already a prisoner of the village, and it wasn't like he'd stolen the technique or anything. It was a credit to Ami that the violet didn't seem at all put off by his hesitance. As far as I can tell, the kunoichi who uses it applies a thin layer of wind chakra to the soles of her feet, sort of like the water walking exercise, but as a nature transformation. Then you expand and contract the chakra to the timing of your movements, and... His eyes narrowed a moment in concentration as he slowly began to bounce on one foot. Slowly though, it wasn't the ground he was bouncing on as he rose into the air bit by bit. Finally, he lost focus. He hadn't really spent a lot of time trying to learn this before realizing he had better ways of moving faster, and dropped back to the ground. Well, you get the idea. The only reason he'd gotten as far as he had with the Taki Jinchuriki's signature jutsu was his extensive experience with Futon Chakra during his work on the completed Rasengan. Helpful for maneuvering around a battlefield, or escapes if need be. He regretted adding that last note as he noticed some of the enthusiasm drained from Ami's posture. Too soon perhaps. Still, when you master it. And he had no doubt that she would, given time, you'll have a means of moving incredibly fast, silently, and unpredictably. Kami knew it had given him the run around the first time he was forced to deal with it. With that little reaffirmation, Ami nodded, turning to look curiously at her feet. Right, now you've all had a chance to recover. He took a moment to savor the sweet horror that entered their eyes. Let's get going. Ebizuruga guy isn't getting any younger. How hard could it be to track down somebody that famous anyway? He should have known better than to tempt the gods. Tsunade was a wily one. Even with her rather distinctive description, she was able to completely elude all of her pursuers with what had to be practiced ease. It wasn't hard to pick up a trail on her. He just had to flash a photo and most of the people in the various gambling dens they searched could remember her. He could only imagine why. It was following the leads that proved nearly impossible. Tsunade seemed to have a habit of leaving in the middle of the night, without informing anyone at the hotels she stayed at. It made figuring out where she was going problematic. The only advantage they had going was their speed. Tsunade meandered around at about a civilian pace, according to whatever whim drove her. They, on the other hand, were able to zip between towns in a fraction of the time. Unfortunately, this meant their only solution was to try and nail down a timeline of the Slug Sunin's visits by going to every nearby town in turn, then repeating that process while hoping she wasn't getting even further away. After a few days of this, Naruto was even beginning to figure out the beginnings of a pattern. Tsunade had a tendency to visit larger towns when she could, better gambling dens and finer alcohol, and only made for the smaller, fringe villages when the heat from her various debtors became too much. Right now, despite their own pursuit, Tsunade hadn't caused much trouble in a while, so she was a lot more likely to head to the bigger, flashier casinos. So, when they slowed from their grueling pace at the outskirts of Miizugai, the red-headed Hokage was feeling optimistic. After a few moments to give his team time to recover, they were needing less and less of that as the week progressed. They ambled into the town with all the nonchalance that only trained ninja could properly muster. There appeared to be some form of festival going on, although that wasn't too surprising. Every town had their own traditions and special days, and they were all looking for any excuse to attract tourists and bump off a day or two of work. Sundown was still a few hours away, so only a handful of people were perusing the stalls, most of which were still being set up, so the shinobi quartet didn't draw too much attention as they threaded through the streets towards the seedier area of town. They were sure to find the gambling halls. It took another hour of scoping out Chohan games, knucklebones, and a number using Karuta, before they struck lucky, sort of. They were passing their fifth gambling hall of the evening when they heard a commotion from the other side. Before they could even investigate, a man's head suddenly broke through the wall, looking suitably dazed for somebody who had apparently just head-butted a few inches of plaster. His eyes widened in horror a few moments later as the rest of his body promptly joined him in a shower of dust and wall fragments. He was promptly followed by a fretting young woman with short, dark hair who, for some reason, was clutching a pig. "I'm so sorry about this, she's usually much better at restraining herself." Naruto and his team took all this in with a quiet sort of amusement. The redhead noted that the village's records of Shizune Kato were wildly out of date. She had grown up a lot from the young girl Tsunade had absconded with just before the Third Shinobi War. As if by clockwork, the young woman's master was quick to join them, climbing through the hole she had made with a drunken elegance that was only counteracted by years of hard-wired shinobi reflexes. She still managed to trip over a bit of loose debris. The Sunin wasn't what Naruto had expected. Hiruzen had warned that she had a tendency to change her appearance around to throw off pursuers that weren't well versed in genjutsu. Still, he had been expecting a woman of middling years bearing the proud stature suitable of somebody with her storied past. He should have known better than to put stock in such legendary figures. Jiraiya was Exhibit A on that front. Instead, Team 7 saw a woman who didn't look much older than Anko stumble out of the gambling den. "That's Jiraiya's teammate?" Ami asked, bewildered at the sight of the young woman berating the battered man with a drunken slur. She was trying to reconcile the image she had of the Toad Sunin with the bombshell blonde before them. The woman who was supposedly Tsunade wore clothes that would have made Naruto's fiancé proud, with a revealing white top and red skirt over mesh underclothing. The only thing that properly identified her was the iconic blue diamond on her forehead and the jacket draped over her shoulders that bore the kanji for gamble on the back. Shizune finished healing the man just in time for Tsunade to launch her now empty bottle of sake at his head, getting him to sprint away like he had glimpsed hell itself. Naruto chose that moment to make their presence known. "Tsunade Senju." Shizune took notice first, her eyes going wide and panicky as they flickered between the Konoha team and her mentor. Tsunade lacked even that much situational awareness as she took a few moments to turn ponderously. It looked as though any faster would have caused her to fall over, and glare at them suspiciously. "Who's asking?" The tone was more than a little confrontational. Naruto's gaze flickered between the two women and the hole in the wall where, even now, patrons from the hall were beginning to peek their heads through to watch the confrontation with a kind of morbid curiosity. There was also the owner of the gambling hall lamenting the destruction of his property, but he was going largely ignored. "Perhaps we could move somewhere a bit quieter," Naruto suggested, earning a surprisingly grateful look from Shizune. It took a fair amount of coercion from her illogically older ward, but they eventually managed to get Tsunade situated in the far booth of a nearby bar. Apparently, all it took was the promise of more liquor. If that was the case, then getting the woman back to Konoha might not have been such a problem. Unfortunately, the moment he brought the idea up, Naruto had to compare the sound the blonde made to a large piece of fabric being torn in half a few times. "You shouldn't be finding this funny, I'm very serious. It's time for you to come back to the village." He thought his voice conveyed that quite well. Tsunade seemed to disagree. "Or what exactly?" she declared with all the swagger afforded to her by her blood alcohol content. Naruto had a certain tolerance for people taking advantage of his goodwill, or even the occasional joke at his expense. If he didn't, Anko would have been found strangled in her sleep years ago. That tolerance wasn't without limit though, so when his eyes narrowed slightly and an unidentifiable pressure settled over the booth, his student quickly snapped out of their goggling. Over Tsunade's reputation, drunkenness, or bust varied between the three of them, and subtly shifted away from their sensei. "Or you'll be branded an S-rank missing nin under the authority of the Godaime Hokage, like you should have been years ago for your flagrant dereliction of duty for over 2 decades. You could have heard a fly gasp in the silence that settled over the bar, at least until Tsunade let out an undignified snort, nearly knocking over her drink as she banged the table. Oh, it's too funny when the young ones try to front up." Naruto sighed and leaned back in the booth, the noise rushing back into the room like the return ripple from a particularly violent splash. "You're clearly too drunk to talk to, we'll be back when you've sobered up a bit." Tsunade just jeered at him, sloshing her drink expertly so that she didn't spill a drop. "Yeah, good luck with that." Naruto stood up and made to leave, already planning how he'd position his team so that they could best watch the potential exits from the town. Tsunade wasn't getting away after all the trouble they had gone to tracking her down, only to pause as the woman quitted. She was staring into her saucer of sake, idly tilting it this way and that and watching her reflection shift and distort. So, the old goat finally stepped down again. Who's the sucker who was stuck with that shit show? Naruto took a moment to debate the worth of continuing the conversation before sitting back down. "You're looking at him." The blonde snorted childishly at the fact he'd called himself a sucker before tilting her head up to look him over. You don't look like much, what's with the dumb coat? She managed to get a twitch out of the redhead for that, especially considering the houri she was wearing wasn't dissimilar to his. I suppose you'll be the one sending the goons after me when all this goes official. Naruto tilted his head. She didn't seem all that concerned with being on the run. He supposed it wasn't all that different to the life she lived now. In fact, he could see her point. Given her famed power and her experience evading people, there probably weren't many that could take her in. Jiraiya, the sentimental bastard, would probably refuse on principle. Instead, Naruto leaned across the table with a vindicative smile, placing a hand on the woman's shoulder so that she was forced to meet his steeled gaze. I assure you, if I do put that order through, and I will, I'll be the one dogging your trail every step of the way. The blonde met his stare without fear, grinning right back as she downed another swig of sake straight from the bottle. Seems like a lot of work for the incumbent Hokage. Don't you have some paperwork to go and drown in? Work? Depends on how attached you are to that coat, he shot back as he settled back into the booth. Tsunade gave him a confused look before glancing at her shoulder, just in time to watch a hydration tag swirl to life. It took her alcohol haze of a mind a moment to recognize her own uncle's technique before she sneered, quickly shedding the coat and throwing it at the redhead's face and standing up. There you go, enjoy the show while you can. She sidled out of the booth, pulling Shizune with her, because next time you track me down I'll start by breaking every bone in your arm. She absently crushed the sake bottle in her hand. And there are a lot of them. Tsunade-sama, please. To everybody's surprise it was Sakura who called out, deftly climbing out of the booth to stand in front of the legendary medic. There are so many in the hospital who could use your help, so many medics who could be that much better with your teaching. The blonde gave the girl a searching look, taking in her neat, clinical appearance and the telltale signs of medical equipment in her pouch. You get your kids to fight your battles now? Tsunade asked, not even turning to address Naruto. You're fitting into your position already. She shouldered past the disillusioned Pinkette easily, only pausing again when Naruto called out. It doesn't have to be this way, Hiruzen is basically gifting you the hospital. Free run of how things work, entire overhauls if need be. He wants his student back just as much as the village needs you. To her credit, Tsunade did turn back, if only to flip the redhead off. On second thought, maybe you're not such a good Hokage, the sweet talk is supposed to come before the threats in negotiation. Naruto had risen to meet her, undaunted by her narrowed eyes. Yeah, well I was always more of a doer than a diplomat. I'm still learning that part. Besides, I've read all about you, what the village took from you, what you've lost. I didn't think you'd come back just because a few bounty hunters were after your head. It was mostly for the old man I even bothered. So, are we done here? Tsunade growled, already turning to leave. What I had heard though, was that you were a gambler. Tsunade stopped in her tracks. What of it? Well? How about a wager? Are you alright? Sakura asked as Tsunade's apprentice, Naruto's 3 students, and the pig, who had been introduced as Taunton at some point, stood at the edge of the small garden. You don't look too worried about all of this. She motioned vaguely to Tsunade and Naruto, who had taken up in the middle of the garden across from one another at a large stone slab. Oh, I'm just sort of resigned to it at this point. Indeed, the young woman seemed to be fretting in a remarkably controlled, practiced manner. Tsunade-sama does what she wants and I'm just sort of here to, well, I'm just sort of here. Ami frowned from the other side of Sakura. That doesn't sound right. Shizune's eyes widened as she instantly began backtracking over her words. Oh, don't mistake me. Tsunade-sama is a wonderful woman, I learn more from her than I could have imagined. She only really gets this way when the memories become particularly bad, otherwise she can be quite lovely. Yeah, but what about what you want to do? Ami soldiered on, with all the tact that Anko had forced out of her. Shizune simply took on a wistful smile at that as she glanced back to the main event. What about your sensei? Naruto seems like a remarkable man himself, to challenge Tsunade in a contest of strength like this. Sakura and Ami shared a look at that. Sasuke might have joined in, but he was somewhat busy scrutinizing the pig sitting in his lap with a perplexed expression. Why is this pig wearing a pearl necklace? Yeah, that's Naruto-sensei. Ami answered, ignoring Sasuke completely. Unpredictable as ever. But do you really think he can win? Shizune asked, glancing back at the pair. Somehow the poor bartender had been roped into all of this and was doing an admirable impression of a rabbit stuck in front of a fire jutsu. I mean, I know Tsunade-sama has a reputation when it comes to gambling, but an arm wrestle? Ami and Sakura shared another look before shrugging at the same time. It's Naruto-sensei. Sure enough, the two in question were just squaring up their arms on the table, the nervous bar owner glancing between them furtively. You ready to have those arm bones crushed earlier than expected, Namikaze? Tsunade asked, wearing a savage grin as she clenched and unclenched her hand experimentally. Naruto on the other hand looked quite neutral about the whole affair. Just as long as we're still clear on the rules. Yeah, best 2 out of 3. You win. Her eyes betrayed just how likely she thought that was. I go back to the village and take up as chief medic. And when I win, Konoha pays off my gambling debts and leaves me the hell alone. Naruto nodded his affirmation and motioned for the bartender to do his thing, locking hands with the grinning Sunin. The barkeep placed his hand atop theirs and, after a quick muttered prayer, began counting down. 3, 2, 1, G-. The slam of Tsunade's hand hitting the stone table could have made the daimyo's court silent. For everyone watching, it was as though both their arms were upright one moment, then flat to the side the next, at no point occupying the space between. Both Tsunade and Shizune were staring at it opened mouths while Naruto's students looked on smugly from the sidelines. Fast. The Sunin recovered quickly, glaring across at the redhead. You cheated. Naruto stared right back, now sporting a smirk of his own. We're shinobi, there's no such thing. Tsunade reset her features and put her arm back up. Well, it won't work a second time. And Naruto could see that it wouldn't. The muscles in her arm were already tensed when they locked fingers. Luckily that wasn't the only trick in his bag. 3, 2, 1, G-. This time the last word was drowned out by the sudden flare of power from both shinobi. A thin aura of yellow enveloped Tsunade, clearly hoping to overpower Naruto in an instant just as he had her. But the Namikaze was holding on admirably, his skin starting to turn red as he unlocked the first 3 inner gates. It was a technique he didn't like using, thinking it too short-sighted and damaging for the advantage it gave. Still, he had explored a lot of avenues for increasing his speed when he was younger. Currently 3 gates was as far as he could go. He would have to do something to thank Guy when he got back, maybe give him some way to track down Kakashi? It still didn't seem enough though, as, inch by inch, his hand was forced down. 3 gates were a lot, but against the Sunin's raw, unmatched strength he might as well have been doing nothing at all. It seemed inevitable when his hand finally touched the stone table, cracking it slightly under the pressure of their combined aura. Both let go instantly, Naruto quickly locking his chakra back down again as his skin returned to its normal tanned hue. The gates, huh? Nice trick, Tsunade said, with all the swagger of somebody who thought victory was already theirs. And not my last, Naruto shot back, putting his arm back up without hesitation. It took them a moment to realize that nobody was coming to adjudicate the contest, as the bartender had passed out at some point during their last exchange. Instead Ami bounced over, cheerfully putting her hands over theirs. Kick her ass, sensei, she declared, quickly moving on before either could react. 3, 2, 1. Go. Through exuberance alone was her voice heard over the sudden wave of barely restrained energies the 2 powerful shinobi released. Naruto instantly unlocked all 3 gates again, but Tsunade simply let her hand stay where it was, taunting him with her immovability. She didn't even try to push him down, meeting his eye with a victorious smirk. The moment she did though, he made sure she regretted it. In that single moment of distraction, he went through the first 2 steps of creating a Rasengan, in the hand that was currently clasped against Tsunade's. In the time it took the signal to travel from her hand, that her grip had been almost forcibly loosened by the sudden outpouring of spiraling energy, up to her brain, Naruto had already forced her hand down onto the table with the dull thud of a tomb being sealed. There was 1, long moment of utter silence in the little garden before the slab of stone they were using as a table gave a suffering groan, and split clean in two. I win. Chapter 40, Official Trouble. Tsunade was surprisingly gracious in defeat, only trying to escape once during the night. Eventually though, after a great deal of childish resistance, flailing, complaining, as well as name-calling, although that was mainly Ami's input, the strange group began their trek back to Konoha. It was a significantly more sober Tsunade who suddenly found herself on the receiving end of an inquisitive Sakura. It was quite the novel experience for the older woman, as she was used to Shizune's quiet acceptance of whatever it was she had to teach. Sakura on the other hand grew up in an environment of questioning being encouraged, both by Naruto and her superiors at the hospital. Having the world's greatest medicnin on hand was an opportunity she was never going to pass up. Naruto watched the exchange bemusedly towards the rear of the group, where Shizune was trailing along quietly, clutching her pig as if it were a lifeline. "Hi, we never got to be introduced properly," he greeted suddenly, shifting his eyes from the bickering medics to the startled woman to his side. "Naruto Namikaze." He held a hand out and, after a moment, Shizune accepted it, receiving a disgruntled expression from Taunton as she was jostled during the exchange. Nobody had worked up the courage to ask about the pig yet, at least not in front of said pig. "Oh, I know. Tsunade-sama might act distant and uncaring, but even on our travels, word reached us about the new Hokage." She gave him a strange smile he couldn't quite figure out. "Shizune Kato, it's nice to meet you." She seemed about to turn her gaze forward again but thought better of it, looking down at the road. "I can't imagine that kind of responsibility for somebody so young." The redhead grinned sheepishly, used to the platitude, if it wasn't congratulations it was usually something along those lines. "To be honest, it's not nearly as bad as I thought it would be. Sure, there's a lot of pressure, but I have Hiruzen to ease me in, and it's mostly just making sure all the right decisions get made, or making sure that I'm the one making the wrong ones. Paperwork mostly." He glanced forward, noting Sakura and Tsunade seemed to be in some intense debate over one thing or another. "It's your responsibility I'm not envious of." Shizune didn't even have to follow his gaze to catch his meaning. "You and Tsunade-sama got off on the wrong foot, but I'm sure with time she'll warm up." Despite appearances, she's not one to hold grudges. Both instantly, and unaware that they were mirroring each other, thought of a certain snake. "Most of the time." Her smile brightened slightly. "I think this trip home will be good for her. And you?" The unofficial Kunoichi nearly tripped over her feet at the sudden question. What do you mean?" "Just a thought," Naruto mused. "This whole trip was about bringing Tsunade back to the village. Nobody asked what you thought about all this." Shizune seemed conflicted about that. "I go where Tsunade-sama goes, I'm her apprentice." The redhead just hummed thoughtfully. Squirming slightly under the sudden lull in the conversation, Shizune was forced to incline her head. "I admit, I'm quite excited to finally come home. It's been so long since I've seen the village." She chuckled quietly into her sleeve. "I'm sure it's changed so much since I was a girl." Naruto matched her smile. "One, soon to be two whole heads." He glanced up at the sky. "But you would be surprised. No matter how much it changes, or grows, or is rebuilt, there's always something uniquely Konoha about that village. I think I could be gone for 100 years and still know it by sight." "You have a lot of fond memories then." "My whole life, in one way or another." "It must be nice, to have a place grounded in feelings like that." She nearly jumped when he patted her lightly on the shoulder. "Well, if all goes well, and Tsunade doesn't pull a runner, you might too." Shizune smiled at that, and Naruto silently affirmed his belief that Tsunade wouldn't be the only one benefiting from a return home. This poor girl had basically dedicated her life to her master, mostly because she'd known little else. While he wouldn't denigrate their relationship, he could see it was a deep one. Giving Shizune some freedom to choose for a change would do her a world of good. And if it got Tsunade to grow up and stop acting like a child, all the better. Although, glancing forward and spotting the young-looking blonde throw a stone petulantly at the back of Sasuke's head, he wasn't holding out hope on that front. "Remind me to introduce you to Anko when we get back. I think you two might be able to get on." "A friend of yours?" Fiancé actually, she's pregnant with our first child at the moment. At that, Shizune's smile grew a lot brighter. Oh, I love babies. And, as though some magic word had been spoken to the gods, Sakura and Ami were suddenly in front of them, burying Shizune in baby talk. Naruto had to smile at the sight, his mind drifting to what his lover was doing at the moment. So, Anko began, absently tossing a kunai up and down as she leaned back in her chair. Some would have said that was a dangerous combination for a pregnant woman. They'd never met Anko holding a kunai. We didn't exactly have a stellar first meeting, granted. Fu simply glared at her from across the table. Look, no need to give me that look, this is supposed to be a friendly chat. The purple-haired woman finally seemed to realize what she was doing and deftly returned the kunai to an undefined location on her person. See, friendly. Okay, I get it, you're a prisoner, sort of, in an enemy village, so you're doing the whole stubborn silence bit. I understand. But really there's no need, the war's over. She extended a hand over the table. How about we start over? Fu simply switched her glare to the hand. I don't give a crap about all of that, Taki can go and suck one. They abandoned me here when they got spanked during this whole ill-advised war, then ran off with their tails between their legs. Have they even asked for me back? Before Anko could answer she continued anyway. Me, not their Jinchuriki? Anko's mouth closed with a snap. Thought so. No, I couldn't give two shits about my village, cowards the lot of them, no, what I'm trying to figure out is how the hell Naruto settled for you. You could have dropped a coin in the room and it still would have been smothered by the oppressive silence that suddenly seemed to radiate out of Anko. Her hand hung there for a moment, still extended for a shake, only to close slowly into a fist and draw back with painstaking precision. When Anko was finished counting to 10 in her head, an exercise Sakura had recommended to her if she ever felt unduly stressed, she let out a long breath. You are very lucky that I'm pregnant, or you'd be learning if your hair tastes as minty as it looks. Fu just rolled her eyes. Can we get through with this already? I was told I'd have some Jonin chaperone for a month or two to settle me into the village. Wasn't that how this whole exchange is supposed to go? She acted nonchalant, but the sickly sweet smile Anko was giving her was beginning to creep her out. Sure, why not? She made vague gesture and a nearby section of wall opened up to reveal a tall blonde-haired man with an easy smile. This is Inoichi Yamanaka, his family has agreed to sponsor you for your probation tenure. My daughter's actually quite excited to meet you, apparently something to brag about to a friend of hers. Oh great, Fu drawled. I've been turned into a life-sized accessory. She's also very interested in studying the psychological impact of long-term attention deprivation and the effects it has on a Jinchuriki's psyche, with hopes for treatments through graduated acceptance therapy. Both women blinked nearly simultaneously while Inoichi smiled. Normal teenage girl stuff. Fu shook her head to clear out the potentially disturbing imagery there and turned back to Anko. You know, I half expected Naruto to be here. Anko's eye twitched slightly at that, reminded that if her fiancé, and boy didn't it just make her giddy thinking that, wasn't out looking for the slug Sunin, he probably would be here. Yes, well, luckily. I mean, currently the village has laws that prohibit the Hokage from getting personally involved with any shinobi transfers. Fu leaned back in her chair at that, sighing with an expression caught between bemused and disbelieving. So he actually did it, huh? She looked back down, a slightly more genuine smile on her face once she understood that even if she riled these people up they weren't going to snap at her. It felt comfortable knowing that a fellow Jinchuriki was running the show, it at least offered a glimmer of hope that she wouldn't just be used up and tossed away like a sharper-than-normal kunai. So, when's the wedding? Her only answer was Anko slamming the door shut behind her, leaving the vedette alone with Inoichi. He was still wearing that carefully measured smile that somehow put Fu both at ease, and on edge. If my daughter asks to look in your mind, no matter how insistently, please refuse. Fu blinked. Sure. I think I would have anyway. Inoichi's smile simply shifted, suggesting he knew one of those terribly amusing things that shouldn't be shared in polite company. You say that, but she has a way with people. But she's still not ready for a Jinchuriki's mind. Right. Fu said slowly, already wishing Enko would come back. She would rather have simmering anger than, whatever this was. Naruto let out a long, relieved exhale as he sank back into his chair. He had thought it impossible, but he had actually missed the wood-paneled office with its comfy, plush chair and desk polished by the wrists of 4 different Hokage. He hadn't missed the stack of paperwork innocently sitting off to the side, but that was what shadow clones were for. That, and messing with people, and exploding, because that trick never got old. So, I haven't missed anything catastrophic then. No, Hiruzen smiled amusedly, nothing so awful as that. Although if you could officiate your sojourns out of the village to be a bit more occupationally appropriate next time. Don't worry, I'm pretty sure that now I'm back something will pop out of the woodwork that requires my attention, it always seems to work like that. Hiruzen's eyebrow simply quirked. I'm not quite sure I know what you mean. Really? I've just gotten back from a mission bringing Tsunade back dash. A story I very much look forward to hearing by the way. And nothing went wrong in my absence, something is going to happen soon. At least, if being the Hokage is anything like being an Umbu captain in that regard. I think you're being a bit pessimistic, my boy. I'm afraid as Hokage you might have to get used to long stretches of relative peace and quiet. Yeah, but that's the stickler, isn't it? Naruto argued, waggling a finger knowingly. Relative peace just isn't the same for me, everyone knows it. I'm a trouble magnet. If you say so, my boy, Hiruzen said, clearly looking as though he simply thought Naruto was a bit tired after his trip. Although, as if just to prove him wrong, an Umbu faded into the room and quickly handed over a thicker-than-average report that had all the trappings of being a skip-the-stack kind of document. Naruto took a moment to waggle it at the former Hokage for emphasis. I'm sure it's just a field report, a coincidence at best. Although his conviction wavered as Naruto thumbed through the report, expression growing more troubled as he read. The Sanbai has destroyed a fishing village on the east coast. He slapped the sheaf of papers down, sucking his teeth. Well, now I don't feel like saying I told you so. Hiruzen quickly shared his expression. Biju are always political nightmares. Technically the Sanbai belongs to Kirigakure, and this could be anything from an attack. He glanced at the map table, specifically the tiny village south of the Land of Waves that was now a lot smaller, although unusually placed, to an accident. I'm more inclined to think that, given the result of their civil war, we're not dealing with a Jinchuriki. A wild Biju then, even more problematic. Quite. This was actually something that fell outside of Hiruzen's extensive experience. Uncontained Biju were rarely Konoha's problem, save for the one very obvious exception. Even now, Naruto was fighting back flashes of slitted red eyes surrounded by fire and unbearable screams. Suffice it to say, he remembered that particular night all too vividly, and the thought of similar destruction forced his fingers to tap restlessly against the desk. Hiruzen must have gleaned something from the look in his eye as he immediately sighed. I would advise extreme caution in the matter, we're dealing with exceedingly delicate international matters here. Naruto nodded in an absent manner that didn't exactly fill the former Hokage with confidence. How long would it take to organize a political envoy to Kirigakure? It was to his credit that Hiruzen was barely fazed by the seemingly random turn in the conversation. A few days at most, given the current climate in Mizu no Kuni. He had already figured some of what was running through the younger redhead's mind and, for once, was glad he was acting with a bit more forethought than simply rushing into the problem head first. Wagers didn't tend to work on Biju. I think Kiri has had long enough to recover, and we're in the rather unique situation of being rather lax on allies currently. With Kiri shoring up their coastline, it would certainly discourage Kumo from any more ill-advised action, or at least give the Raikage pause. Likewise, since the shaky situation with Tsunagakure's invasion, their trade in more exotic goods had run a bit dry. Having access to Kiri's recovering sea trade would be a boon. Getting a toe in the door for Konoha's spy network wouldn't hurt either. The island nation had been a black spot on their radar for decades, and in the lull of their internal victory they might not notice a few extra faces in the crowd. Naruto was magnanimous most of the time, but he could still think like the leader of a shinobi village. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like a good idea, and with a final nod he stood and made for the door. I'll let my team know, it'll be good for them to get a crash course on politics. He was forced to stop when Hiruzen stepped in his path, an expression on his face that Naruto recognized when the man was offering advice he thought non-optional. If I might recommend a softer touch. He placed a hand on Naruto's shoulder when he caught the Hokage's narrowed eyes. I'm not suggesting that spending so much time with your team is a bad thing, Naruto, or even that they might be unsuited for the task. He inclined his head. They need to find their own paths, Naruto. As a teacher you need to understand this. I know you care for them, and I admit you have done a wonderful job with their training. But you also need to step back every now and then and let them expand on their own. Let them take a few missions with their peers, relax in their roles. Oversight is a handy tool, but in excess it can be smothering. No offense, but I've seen the effects of hands-off teaching firsthand, not a fan. Hiruzen's eyes became flat at that. None taken. Orochimaru will continue to be a stain on my tenure as Hokage for as long as that monument stands. But my point stands, you cannot be there for your students all of the time. Sometimes the best way we can protect the people we care about is to make sure they can protect themselves. Naruto clicked his tongue, mulling it over for a moment. I can see your point, and Sasuke would probably complain about the mist anyway. Ami has been looking for an excuse to hang out with her sister more, and nobody knows better than me how much Sakura is needed in the hospital. I'm sure I can hang back a bit more. Hiruzen smiled at that, glad at least Naruto wasn't simply capitulating and was at least examining the merits of the idea. That's for the best is. He spared another glance at the Sanbai report. Aside from the occasional unique case, you will be spending a lot of time in the village. Your team will still need to go on missions, often without you. Fine, Naruto drawled, waving his hand as he walked back to the desk. I understand. But that just means I have to train them twice as hard when I do have them around. The point was punctuated by a particularly vicious smile ripped right out of Anko's book as he sank back into his chair. Hiruzen recognized the look all teachers wore at some point or another. I certainly wouldn't deny you that. Elsewhere, three Chunin suddenly felt a chill pass down their spine. I'll make sure the diplomatic envoy is ready to head out as soon as possible. Now if you'll excuse me, I have my own student to catch up with. Naruto nodded, already tuning the rest of the world out as he returned to the backed-up paperwork he'd be wrestling with for the next 4 hours. She's at the hospital, I believe, said something about getting her new domain straightened out. Hiruzen could only smile fondly. I'm sure she is. Who the hell filed these patient forms? It's like searching through shit in a pig pen for all the good it does. She slammed the cabinet shut with a clang that pierced through even the general din of the hospital. I thought you lot would be a little competent from the look of the pinkette back there, but it's clear I'm working with amateurs. She stuck an arm out and grabbed a fistful of the nearest scrambling orderly. Where's Yakushi-sensei? I don't know, Lady T.S. Tsunade. Do you always stutter like this? She asked, loudly, her face about an inch from his. No. Are you asking me or telling me? Telling. The de-aged Sunin let go of his scrubs forcefully, corner of her mouth curled up into a sneer. He just seemed to hover there before Tsunade rounded on him again. Well? Go find Yakushi-sensei already. The orderly was like a rabbit that had been thrown in the middle of a busy road, suddenly darting off into the madness that had been the hospital since Tsunade's unannounced return. The blonde watched him go for a bit before turning back to the general maelstrom of the ICU. Gradually her grimace slipped into the smallest smirk. I can work with this. Her musing was quickly interrupted by a rather unwanted sensation. She looked down to see a young woman with her purple hair pulled up into a ponytail that fanned out behind her head. That wouldn't have been so unusual if the woman wasn't also gently poking one of her breasts with an odd expression. Holy crap, if anything the stories were under-exaggerating these bad boys. She seemed blissfully unaware of the vein slowly throbbing on Tsunade's forehead, even as she met the woman's eye without a shred of shame. What the heck do you eat? Behind her a different woman wearing a thorn-patterned dress was staring at her friend with disbelieving eyes. Tsunade was about to knock the obnoxious woman through a wall, only to glance down and notice the telltale beginnings of a bump. She was rather glad to have noticed before she heard a pregnant woman. It was at that point that she noticed the woman hadn't actually stopped prodding her, and they were beginning to draw a crowd, mostly men. Stop that! She growled irritably, slapping the Violet's hand away. Sorry, the woman replied sheepishly, rubbing the back of her head and not looking all that apologetic. It's just. She motioned to the Tsunade's chest with a flourish, finishing with an eyebrow waggle that suggested all that needed to be said. For a second Tsunade feared she was looking at a female Jiraiya. A Jiraiya she couldn't hit, the thought was genuinely chilling. Yes, I have big breasts, you have eyes. Was that the diagnosis you were in here for? Without violence Tsunade defaulted to sarcasm, it managed to be nearly as biting. Big? Lady, you graduated from sweater puppies to full-on sweater wolves. They're not just bongos, you've got the full percussion section in there. I'd motorboat them, but I don't have the money for a yacht. You can't even call them knockers anymore, they're more like gongs. If they were ski slopes they'd be double black diamonds, parachute required. I mean geez, when you cross your arms does the ground get pulled up by their gravity? Far from the previous bustle of the waiting room, a dead silence had managed to creep in sometime during her rant. Tsunade did in fact cross her arms and, to her credit, the woman appeared somewhat disappointed. I guess not. Are you done? The Violet simply shrugged. I was trying to think of a fruit bigger than melons but, yeah, I'm done. Lovely. The Sunin drawled. Outwardly she was disgruntled by the whole exchange, inwardly she was somewhat impressed. Most people wouldn't have the spine or balls to say all of that to her face. Well, they certainly wouldn't after they'd said it. Oh, sorry. That was rude of me. She suddenly stuck out her hand. I'm Anko. Tsunade just sucked it up, reminding herself over and over this woman was pregnant. I had thought you might be. She vaguely remembered Naruto describing his fiancée on the trip back to Konoha, it certainly explained a lot. You in for the baby. She motioned to Anko's stomach only for the woman to wave her off with a laugh. What? Nah, that's all sorted for now, I'm here to see somebody. Feisty redhead with an attitude problem, I don't know what room they're in. Tsunade just snorted. It's called the Hokage's office, you're in the wrong building for that. Anko shared her grin for a moment. Funny, but no. She's called Tayuya Uzumaki, Naruto asked me to check in on her. Being treated for nerve damage and some kind of withdrawal I think. Tsunade had stopped listening at Uzumaki, suddenly grabbing the nearest nurse with all the subtlety of an elephant learning to dance. Where are the patient files for long-term care? It took the poor woman a few moments to gather her bearings before shakily pointing into a room behind the main desk. Tsunade released her and immediately vaulted the counter, quickly rifling through the admittance records before grabbing a particular sheet of paper and rushing off into the hospital corridors, only pausing to glance back at Anko. Well, are you coming? Anko glanced back at Kurenai with a grin, the woman having been speechless throughout the entire debacle. Wow, Naruto was onto something bringing her back, the service here's gotten way better. She quickly followed the older woman, navigating by the tide of shocked hospital staff the blonde had left in her wake. Kurenai just gave a suffering sigh, pinched the bridge of her nose, and quietly followed on. Well, how was I supposed to know she would be asleep? You would have if you had followed normal hospital protocol. I would have, if you hadn't suddenly gone all gung-ho, charging through the dim hallways. I got distracted by the sudden knowledge I still have some distant relatives, sue me. Besides, it's my damn hospital. Distracted? You want to talk about distracted with those chesticles bouncing all over the shop. Anko, is this really Dash? The shadow waited until a solid 5 minutes had passed from the door quietly snapping shut, before letting out the breath he had been holding. The conversation between the three women had been amusing enough, but with every second they stayed he risked exposure. The Hokage was distracted with his preparations to leave the village again and hadn't got around to assigning a new guard to the recovering Uzumaki's room. This was his best shot. If he waited much longer the girl would be alert enough to at least draw attention if he tried anything. He had worked in this hospital for so long now that opening the windows from the outside was child's play, despite being reinforced against intrusion. It had been a sabotage long in the works, but the building was practically his now, even with the recent shift in management. The return of the Slug Sunin had been a bit of a surprise, something that was becoming an irritated norm since Naruto had taken up the big red hat, but the chaos from her arrival he could certainly work with. He spared a glance down at Tayuya's sleeping form, red hair splayed out over her pillow. He had to confess this felt like a tremendous loss. He had always argued for Orochimaru to use the girl for more than just guarding a gate. Certainly, they had the other girl, and Karen showed far more of the traits that made the Uzumaki feared and respected. Still, he would have killed for a chance to get this one on the operating table and have a poke around inside. He'd certainly done more for less. It's nothing personal, you understand, Kabuto muttered absently as his hands lit up with the pallid green glow of his chakra scalpels. In a few minutes the nurses would come in only to find the girl had suffered a rather unfortunate brain hemorrhage, a terrible after effect of the enzyme they didn't catch in time. Even the famed Tsunade wouldn't be able to do anything before the girl died. He felt Orochimaru would appreciate the reminder to his old teammate just what Konoha tore away from people. And there was him taking vindictive pleasure in the act. Oh, I suppose it is after all. His glasses glinted slightly in the light streaming through the window as he leaned forward and turned her head, narrowing his eyes to locate just where he would have to make the incision. However, when he brought his hand down to finish the job he found it stuck, as though the air around him had hardened into concrete. He struggled harder but found his body moving in the opposite direction, slowly settling into a slumped posture that had cold sweat percolating on the back of his neck. Troublesome. When Ibiki informed me that you were the likeliest suspect I knew the facts lined up, but I must be getting sentimental. A perfect record, invaluable asset to the hospital, to the point where even your many attempts at the Chunin exams could be overlooked. It'll be irritating to lose such a useful piece. Shikaku hummed thoughtfully, barely having to concentrate to maintain his technique. But then, capturing a silver general always carries risks when playing against a good enough opponent. Kabuto didn't panic. Shikaku Nara was a powerful shinobi, but the shadow techniques of his clan were far from infallible. If he considered him just a well-placed spy he may be underestimating him. But then, if Shikaku was here, the rest of the Inoshikacho wouldn't be far off. That was fine too. Kabuto hadn't spent years as Konoha's deepest mole without learning all he could for this very eventuality. He'd studied the various formations of the legendary team by rote. Shikaku was keeping him facing the wall, likely to hide the positions of his teammates. But Kabuto knew Chaozu would be at the door, covering the main avenue of escape. In a moment Shikaku would modulate his technique, pretending to lose control of it to lull his captive into a false sense of security. Naturally he would expect Kabuto to make for the window, where Inoichi would be waiting to take over his mind. The Yamanaka weren't perfect either. Their technique took time to travel and if he could just duck quick enough it would only be a mindless body he'd have to avoid. Sure enough, he felt the technique weaken for a split second and pulsed his chakra at the perfect moment to destroy it, hopefully throwing Shikaku off guard with the precision of the cut. He turned immediately, already hunkering to duck under the expected mind-body switch technique. He was somewhat caught off guard then, by the clawed hand that caught him right in the face. Tsume easily slung the unconscious spy over her shoulder with a grunt. Well, that was easier than expected. Thought this one was supposed to be something special to go undetected for so long. Shikaku simply shrugged, already skulking off now that his part in this was done. He was, but it doesn't matter how far you can see ahead, when you're already standing on the wrong path. Tsume blinked before glancing over at Chaozu. Translation. The large man grinned. He let his expectations get the better of him. Tsume didn't exactly look pleased at the explanation, it didn't really answer anything. So, where's Inoichi anyway? Thought this was more his thing. Chaozu waved to the window. Busy with his house guest, I've heard his daughter's giving her quite the experience. Tsume let out a bark of a laugh. I bet. From what my Kiba tells me she's quite the talker. She shifted the weight on her shoulder absently, wondering if she could get away with handing him off to Kuromaru. Still, happy to fill in. Chaozu just smiled in that congenial way of his. She had yet to see anything that riled the jolly man up. Maybe Wood could make this semi-permanent, always nice to run with a new pack every so often. Maybe. Chaozu offered, with a glance forward to his friend. We could call it the Tsushikacho. Shikako coughed into his hand. Don't push it. That's it for part 10. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.